This episode contains discussions about sexual violence, trauma, and personal violence. You might find this triggering, and so discretion is advised. If you feel that the content may be triggering or upsetting for you, please consider skipping this episode or listening with a supportive person. There will be details for helplines and places that you can reach for support in the description. But I've got with me Reverend Dr. Megan Powell du Toit to have a conversation. Hi, Megan.
Thanks for having me on.
I love having this conversation, particularly from an angle that I don't get to hear a lot from, which is you're Baptist and females in this space. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, there's not as many of us generally, and then we're not as evenly spread through the denominations, and yeah.
Would you mind just introducing yourself beyond your name, just some of the various things that you're involved in and your own history in ministry?
Yes, so I'm an ordained Baptist minister in Sydney, and I was ordained in, I think, 2004. So getting up towards 20 years. I was in pastoral ministry for about 17 years, and then I left it about 7 years ago. Partially what would be akin to a burnout, I suppose, but also I just had lots going on. But I've been working in academia for the Australian College of Theology, and I've done other work in academia for a long time on the side. And I just finished my doctorate, which looked at tensions within evangelicalism. And I have a podcast and a project with Michael Jensen.
And that is called the podcast.
Oh, yes, I should promote myself. It's called With All Due Respect, and the project's called the WADR Project, WADR.
Yeah, I love the podcast. I think it's so important, so healthy to be able to talk about tricky, contentious subjects when we may disagree and really do it with respect and with honor for one another. So thank you so much for giving that to us. But for today, our conversation is about the well-being space for our clergy in Australia. From your experience, is it a tough gig? Is it really a tough gig?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there would be aspects of it that aren't as tough as in some other fields. I know that, for instance, paramedicals like ambulance, so on, is a very, very, very high rate of burnout. I think perhaps you may be doing more hours if you're a CEO or something like that. But look, yes, it is a really tough gig, I think, because it's so people-oriented. So many things depend on it. We see it as significant, and yet it's often quite unsupported.
Now, I was particularly keen to get your input about women in ministry. We don't hear much about what goes on for women. Is it the same? Is it different from males?
Some of the pressure's the same. I do like that. I can't remember who the quote is, but it was about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers saying that she did the same thing but backwards in heels. So generally it's quite similar, except that there's added difficulties and probably a range of added difficulties that are often not realised, that are more than just overt opposition. There's a whole lot of unconscious bias and systemic problems and so on. So yeah, there's some particular difficulties about being a woman in ministry. And I think that goes, whatever theology that woman has, there will be particular difficulties, yeah.
So my survey picked that up, that women were actually indicating they were more burnt out than their male counterparts. Could you say a little bit about what you think the reasons are? You talked about systematic bias.
Yeah. So we, in the Baptist, we've been ordaining women in New South Wales since 1999. And then some years ago now, the denomination actually went, hang on, we don't seem to be having as good outcomes as we might expect, having made that change. What's happening? So they got as many of the female ministers in a room that they could find and talk to us about it. And that was so confronting because it really brought out things that I knew just from talking to friends. But it was things like at one point they asked, after some discussion, and they sort of come to a horrible realization and said, is there any woman here who hasn't experienced unfair working conditions? And not one hand was raised.
Oh.
So it was things like, and I think a lot of it is people think that women should be grateful for getting to serve, and a lot of women are just wanting to serve God, but that gets taken advantage of. And I think we were very likely to have not be paid, or to be paid under what men were paid, to not be paid for the hours that we did, to not have a title that reflected what we did as opposed to what the men's titles were, to be offered conditions that were not comparable to the men's, including things like being not permanent, or not having the extra tax benefits and so on. Just, every possible way that a working condition could be a problem, women were experiencing it. Yeah.
Gosh. And to your knowledge, what's being done in your denomination?
Yes, I actually think I think it's entrenched within society.
Yeah.
And also I think some ways that men experience being a pastor and the problems with that sort of gets amplified for women. So it's difficult to change quickly. But I do think since then there's been much more of an effort to more overtly put in our guidelines. Baptists, we don't, we tend to have guidelines rather than rules because we're very independent in that sense. That express the importance of women being treated equitably. There's been much more of an effort to look out for the women, to get women onto various committees and positions of leadership and so on, in which their voice can be heard. There's still a lot to be done. But yeah, I do think actually that was a bit of a key turning moment of realising what was happening. Yeah.
So I've said for years that as a female myself, it's rather intimidating entering the ministry space. In the early years, I actually was really anxious, whether it was, being at a conference, speaking, or entering a meeting. Do you think that that's a common experience?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that going into ministry spaces, it's more confronting than other spaces that women might be in, because it's often male dominated. There are people there that don't think that you should even have a voice, or there's disagreement about what kind of leadership you should have. And I think it's common in male dominated areas for women to feel that, and ministry is male dominated, but it's male dominated in a really specific way. So in all contexts, I think, but more in some, that men are given more authority or have more roles open to them. There's different theology at play, and the perception of women who speak up, or take leadership can be quite negative. I think that's across society, but it gets laden with a spiritual aspect in ministry. And I know that people's perceptions of me as an ordained woman with a public voice are often, it's really confronting to me to find out what people think about who I am, or they might meet me and then go, oh, okay, look, actually, you're just sort of a normal person, or, that I'm quite warm, and you think, well, I went into ministry. I don't know what kind of person you're expecting that goes into ministry. So yeah, I think that there is, it really is a very difficult environment. And the only reason, it's so interesting that you get some people who say as a woman that you're entering into ministry because you want power, when in fact you could get a lot more power in other fields. But in all the women that I know are in different places and in different contexts, only do it because they just have a really strong heart for the gospel and just wanting to answer God's call in their life.
Yeah. And trauma. So in my survey, I didn't actually ask for the reasons for why women might be burnt out, but I'm hypothesizing based on my clinical work and experience. But the incidence of trauma as well. I find that sometimes being in the ministry spaces, it can be quite a strong environment. People can be vocal when they're having conversations or having a debate over things. You can have opinions thrown around, arguments, corrections, criticisms being thrown around. I wonder whether, with women tending to be more exposed to trauma, whether that also plays into it.
So I was just reminding someone this morning that 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual violence in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, women in ministry have experienced sexual violence. They've definitely experienced sexual harassment. So, even like the extremely traumatic events women have been through, and that's going to affect how they respond to things, and affect, when they encounter more low key, that we think, well, why are they having such a large response? Well, it's because it's triggering stuff that's happened in the past. Absolutely, yeah.
And I have to go and see if I can fish out a statistic, but even incidental sexual assault, being clapped on the bus, or walking down a street and having someone whistle at you. These are not uncommon experiences for women. We just grow up with it.
No.
Yeah. Do you have a yeah?
I was really, I remember when Me Too happened, and men, male Christians that I knew, were like, oh, I couldn't believe so many women experienced sexual harassment, and I couldn't believe that it wasn't 100%. Like, I'm like, are some women therefore not recognizing it as sexual harassment? Because I thought it's just part and parcel of being a woman. You don't report it even, because you're going, well, this is just every day. And unfortunately, this kind of thing does exist in the ministry, whether it's from other leaders or whether it's from congregants. It's there, yeah.
Which brings me to part of the survey that is so, so sad. And the reason why I reached out to you in the first place, so context was I had put the same sorts of questions that were asked of Australian school principals about the personal violence and threat that they were experiencing. And when I saw that there were women indicating that they had experienced sexual assault in the ministry space, I asked you via Facebook, is this what you're seeing? And you had some things to say about that.
Yeah. I was like, yes, this is known. In fact, in recent times, a lot of the Baptist female pastors and other women in ministry had reached out to the denomination and said, look, we just know anecdotally that there is a lot of whether it's assault or harassment or other types of gendered violence like that women are experiencing that in the ministry. And so we said, can we have some, and they're moving ahead on various actions on that, which is great. But yes, it was just, we were sort of putting together the stories that we'd heard, and we thought, this needs looking into. This seems extraordinarily high to us.
How does this happen, Megan?
I mean, I think one of the issues is it's there everywhere. It is in our parliament, it is in our schools, it is everywhere in Australian culture. So ministry is not immune. And then I think that one of the other aspects that happens is, one, that women don't report because they don't want to affect the ministry of the man. So, they will put up with stuff because they don't want to hurt gospel ministry. But which that, of course, may affect, cause even more hurt to ministry, right? They'll often know the family and be embedded in community with that person. And so therefore they don't want to cause all of the hurt they know is going to happen there. And then, of course, there are the way that we tend to put ministers, particularly male ministers, on a pedestal, that can mean it's more difficult to be believed. So I think there's a whole lot of aspects there that just make it an environment in which, unfortunately, predatory behaviour can flourish.
Oh, that breaks my heart, that last sentence that you just said. How does it equate to, because in one sense, yes, I think you're right. This happens to women in general. There's been a lot of public campaigns, a lot of things that we do in the schools now, a lot of media and social media to help us to counter that fear. Somehow, does that not then translate to ministry? How do we see that as hurting gospel ministry? It blows my mind.
I think part of it too is that's the kind of answers that women have been getting back, whether that's explicit or implicit. But when they try and bring it up, the responses they kind of get are like, don't get in the way of this man's ministry. And I think too, one of the problems is because it's so relationally connected, which is a good thing, right? It's good that it's so relationally connected in churches and denominations. But the problem is that it's not just this man that they don't really know that's done something. It's someone that everyone has been supporting in ministry and thinks is a good guy. And, you know, so suddenly all those relational networks, which in other ways can be quite a good thing and really supportive, can suddenly count against the woman, particularly if there's no women in places of leadership. And so they'll look up and go, well, I can't see any women in the processes that are going to deal with this. Or, I can't see female voices up in like the higher level governmental structure. And so they think, I mean, women throughout Australian society think reporting is going to get me nowhere, but how much more in this kind of situation in which we all know each other?
One of the things that we see in our practice is that, particularly for the women, the loss of community, should they rock the boat in quotes, that the loss of community is massive for people who are in Christian faith. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because it's not just I think this is in general an issue for pastors in that their workplace is often their place of community as well. So I think that's one of the pressures in pastoral ministry. But yes, there is this added aspect as well that you are going to lose all of that support network. The relational support network that helps you through trauma may be lost if you bring stuff up, if you rock the boat. Absolutely. And that'd be, it's not necessarily relationships you've come into as an adult. It's, for me, I was born into Baptist.
Yeah.
It's your life. I mean, that's the problem with people trying to get rid out of cults. And not to say that we're a cult at all, but it is because that is your life, your community, your support network, everything is there.
I think what you've just said is insightful, that we grow up in the church as well. So to leave a job, you don't leave all history. But to leave ministry, to leave church, to leave your faith family is to really move away from a huge part of your life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you do know that potential loss is there. So that can really give you pause, I think.
Again,
and it will be used against you as well. Like that'll be brought up to the women, I think, by the men who were trying to sort of cover things up.
Yeah. So I'll issue a trigger warning now. If you are listening and you have any trauma history, this would be the point to pause, because I'm going to ask Megan a question that might raise some things for you. This is the midpoint break for the podcast. If you want to put a pause and walk away and come back to it, make sure you do check out the description for all the various downloads that we have for you, including my full report, research, and reflections. You might also want to remember to like, share, and subscribe. So stop now or keep going. Do you think that in the ministry setting, the way sexual assault looks is different or more confusing? Like you're not sure. Was this okay? Was this not okay?
I think, look, because it's not a strictly work environment, and because people can be friends, family friends, and so on, that can blur that. Which I think is why, a lot of gendered violence that we see is in intimate relationships for women. It's not a stranger out there. But of course, the church is full of close relationships. So there's that, absolutely, that can blur the lines. But I also think that people, how do I put this? That there's kind of a plausible deniability that people think, well, I haven't seen it happening, or we've had all of the Billy Graham rule and whatever. Well, that kind of rule, which particularly persists in church environments, actually, I think, puts women in danger, because what it makes people think is there's no way it could be happening because we've got all these rules. But I would say, and other women I know would say, some of the sexual harassment that you experience occurs right in front of other people.
Really?
Yeah. So sometimes it's just said quietly, sometimes just still in view, but they've carefully manipulated that so that some bit's not viewed, or, that you can't be heard. Or sometimes it's a pattern of things where there's something that's been done more privately perhaps, but then it's compounded by what's said publicly. But if you just took any individual bits of that, people would go, oh, well, yeah, maybe not the most appropriate, but was it that bad? But that they're not getting the whole pattern of what's occurring between these people. Yeah.
Yeah, just as you're talking, I'm reminded, I think, of my personal advocate space for kids and mission. It's a very similar sort of thing, because people flow in and out of personal and private spaces. There's no diary that blocks out, so and so is coming today. Nothing visible where a lot of people know, okay, this is a contained appointment, contained space. People are in and out of your home. People are, being called upon to be your babies. There's a kind of a false intimacy sometimes, I think, in Christian community. Like, you don't actually know someone, but they're in a lot of your personal and private and unseen spaces, right? In your kitchen, or, in your office, which often, doesn't have any windows or a glass that you can see in through.
And even with the glass that people can see through, it might look all right from the outside, but inside that office, the man's saying something.
Yeah.
So, predators will find their way to get around things. Absolutely. I think there's a false idea that we've got all the procedures in place, or we've got the accountability in place, so this is not going to happen. And as we've seen with some very high profile examples, absolutely it is happening despite those. Yeah.
So I know that you're working with some other women in your denomination to raise this issue. What are some things that you're thinking will help?
So one of the things we wanted to do, and they've started doing it, and it's actually gone from our state to the whole denomination nationally, which is we want to actually survey the women in our churches. That's only very much just started, to find out what their experiences in ministry are. And then from that to sort of dig deeper and find where we need to investigate further. So a lot of that's kind of just going, look, we've got anecdotal evidence, but we don't actually know what's happening out there. And this is a significant portion of our ministry who have a very particular experience. So there's that happening. One of the things that we've did, which has just come through in New South Wales, just went through in the latest assembly, is that we pushed for a quota of women on the 2 elected committees from assembly, because it wasn't there. And even though there was all best intentions to try and get women in those committees, often you'd have one woman or no women or so on. And we know too that one woman is not going to make much of a difference. There's a lot of studies that show that woman is going to feel so isolated that she won't speak up or she won't be heard. So yes, we were kind of saying this is not the whole, there's so much more that needs to be done. But one thing we can do is start making sure that we have women in every level of our governance.
I think that's interesting what you say about how one woman or even 2 women, it's hard to make that difference. I wonder if that's some of the staff profiles we see in church that have more than one minister in the church, where you don't tend to have a lot of women on staff. I wonder what that looks and feels like.
Absolutely. And often women are, certainly in Baptist context, I don't know so much about other contexts. And I think this has changed recently with Baptist, but it was only when you got to the 3rd hire that you got a woman. Like it was like kind of, oh, okay, this is when we need our women, we need a bit more diversity. So it was on bigger teams. If people thought they had one woman, they thought they were doing well, right? So yes, women were often on staff, and still are often on staff teams where they're the only woman. It would be a very large team where you would get more than one woman generally. Yeah. And you might have women in other roles, like administrative roles or so on, but in terms of the pastoral team. And then if you think of other Christian organisations, aid agencies would be different, I think. But if you look into theological education, that would be very similar. Yeah.
So circling back to the issue of burnout for women in ministry, do you think it's also come down to sometimes women are hired as part-timers? Does that factor in?
Absolutely. Like we found when we had that meeting that I was talking about before, that women were often hired part-time but were working more hours than that.
Yeah.
And I think generally what we do see across society, and so this happens for women as well, what's called the wife drought. So that, women are, they're working, they're also doing a lot of the emotional labor and the family and household labor and so on. And so I think male pastors often talk about the emotional labor that they're doing and how that leads to their burnout, but women are already doing that in their other spaces. But yet are often quite exploited without very little, without much authority. So I think if you're the senior pastor, which is very rarely a woman, you can set more of the team ethos and so on. But if you're a woman, you're often just grateful for a job. So you will accept anything, I think, just in order to be able to serve God. And that leaves you very vulnerable in my mind. Yeah.
A lot of times I wonder how we women contribute to the issue as well. What do we bring into the picture, Megan?
Well, we've been, and I've struggled with this my whole life, but just as, men are enculturated in certain ways in how to display their masculinity, women are enculturated in certain ways about how to be feminine. I know, you're valued for being helpful, for not saying no, for always being there for people no matter what. So if you bring that into a pastoral role without sufficient sort of formation, which, teaches you about boundaries and so on, then as a woman, you're really going to struggle with that. And I think often too, it's the women in our churches that are often, they've come in from a side route, and so they don't necessarily have all that formative and mentoring kind of background, which has helped them put in those places, those boundaries and so on.
Oh, that's fascinating. Can you say a bit more about that? You're saying that for women, our formation history even is okay.
Absolutely. In fact, I've had male ministers talk to me about, I've got this woman in my staff and I'm trying to work out how to deal with her and whatever. And I've been like, well, did she go, what's her training? There's all sort of things that I know in theological education and we try and put there with varying success, but, we do try and put there as we train people for the ministry. But quite often women have had they haven't had that pathway. Either they've got no theological training whatsoever, which includes ministerial training, or they've done so in a way which hasn't gone on the same pathway, that hasn't had the same requirements for all of that kind of formational area.
What contributes to that?
Partly, I think that women often go into training without thinking I'm going to go into pastoral ministry. So it kind of comes on them unawares. I think often too, women are often put into roles like children's ministry or women's ministry or so on. And the perception out there, for some reason, is that doesn't require as much training and formation. Now, I think that's a bit ridiculous. I think any pastoral role should require a high level of training and education and so on. But, we've tended to kind of say these kind of roles where there's lots of teaching involved require that. If the person's not doing that, then we don't, that was my cat. Then we don't need as much of that background of equipping and training. And it's just not the case. Sometimes I've looked at the kind of equipping that people see as sufficient for doing women's ministry, for instance, and it really doesn't take into account the difficulties of the pastoral role and how people have to be equipped for it.
I resonate with that. And also because we see other professions, it's a very similar issue for teachers, aides, for example. Women who return to the workforce to be carers, they haven't had the same level of professional investment, intentional training and development and mentoring. And so they're often called in to provide aid and help and skills without the rest of the professional formation, like mental health first aid, for example.
Yeah.
Or knowing how to be psychologically safe in your workplace. That's not an uncommon scenario.
Yeah, and I know what I've been required to do coming up towards, because I'm ordained, coming up to in the accreditation process, what I'm required to do on a continuing basis for my accreditation. There's a lot there that these women are not, it's not like they're choosing not to have it, it's just not being made available to them, or they're not realizing that it's a really important and significant part of their formation for ministry.
Do you know, if I reflect on my own journey, I don't have any theological training, quite frankly, because I couldn't access it. I had kids, I had little babies, working a job to contribute to the family income and things like that. And then by the time you get, like, I'm almost 50 now, you had to then think, I've only got so much more years and so much energy. Where else can I invest? And younger children apparently still need their moms.
Yes. I mean, I think this is, and I've said this in I'm in theological education spaces, so I've said this a lot of times, systems are slow to change, but I think we need a lot more flexibility in how we equip women that takes account of the fact that they will have spaces out of the workplace, that they will be juggling more. We know that women come to pastoral ministry or come to further theological education later than men do in life, and they're carrying a lot more at that time. So yeah, we need to look at what we've got there and go, how do we make this flexible enough and accessible enough for women in the spaces they already are, that they are in? And there's all sorts of ways we can do that, but I don't think there's a lot of intentionality about it yet.
Megan, just what you said there, I think it goes to lifespan development as well. As women progress in their different seasons of life, they take on more caring roles because they've got aging parents, they've got sibling relationships, that they're often the one that they're trying to manage and juggle. And we also have, for women who are in their 50s, we also have a hormonal change. Our mental health goes into different flux. So I'm struck by what you said as how much more intentional we have to be with our women in integrating what they go through in their life. And, some of these things that people genuinely want to keep doing, caring for their parents and, having their kids on their radar. You can't switch those things off.
Absolutely. And I think one of the issues, and I think this applies to men as well, but particularly for women, I think one of our issues has been contributing to burnout is that the minister has been meant to put their ministry above everything else. And families have suffered, right? And I think that definitely puts women off, because women realize, actually, no, that's a significant part. That's my ministry as well, right? I'm doing that for God as well. And that this is a significant part of me as a person. And I actually think those aspects of ourselves actually enrich our ministry. But that's really a change that we need to have in terms of our understanding of ministry, I think, overall. But yes, it has particular impact for women.
And on that note, so the top 3 reasons the people who did my survey gave for quitting the ministry: loneliness, my family suffers, and then work stress. Now, I did some subsequent Mickey Mouse follow-up statistics.
Right.
Thinking, well, are there any denominational
research, right? That's what we say.
Denominational differences, and a smidgen of a difference in the Baptists, in that they weren't quite, they weren't saying as much that they would quit because of loneliness. And I wanted to, ask you, what are you guys doing about the loneliness bit?
Yeah, no, so I'm interested in that, and I agree with you. Yeah, it probably needs further following up, doesn't it? Yes. I mean, one thing that I wondered was, have you managed to sort of separate that by gender? Because I feel like you probably had more women in the Baptist cohort.
Yeah, look, that's a good point. I will go and have a look at that. The answer is, I don't know.
Because we know that men suffer more from loneliness than women. So I'm just wondering whether having more women in your Baptist cohort may have affected it. So I'm interested to know. That's just my sort of research brain there.
Anyone listening, this is a great research project for you to take up.
Yes. So look, I wouldn't want to refine too much on it, because I think you're right. It's an interesting little statistical thing there that needs more work. But one thing I do know that we do is that we have had for a long time now these things called renewal retreat groups, which are getting cohorts together that go on a 3-year journey. We have male ones and female ones, and and you get very, very connected, and people are encouraged to that as soon as they go into ministry, as they're leaving college. And I've facilitated those groups. I've been in them on and off. And that has been it's been really interesting to see the male ministers just learn how to emotionally connect with each other and to have those emotional, deep conversations with each other. Like, it's been extraordinary for them. I think for the female ministers, we thought, oh, this is more of a formalized way of doing what we tend to do anyway. But still, that recognizing that you need support from people who are going through the situation like you, that understand your context, and that we can be there for each other, that's been really significant, I think. And it's been something that's been encouraged from, you know, the denomination. It's been something that's really intentionally been put out there, definitely in New South Wales, but I think it's gone in, I think Victoria does it, and Churches of Christ have also been quite heavily involved, and we've done it with them as well. So I think that there's been a long-term recognition of that is an issue, and we need to help pastors with it.
And how do you feel about attending these things? You look forward to it? You can't wait to hang out with one another?
You know what? I've probably every year gone, oh, I didn't have time to do this. I'm one of the people facilitating it usually, so that's interesting. I'm going, yes, we're all going, and I'm like, because it's you know, it's usually 3 days or something out of your, you know, and you're always very busy in ministry. And every time I've come back and gone, oh, I really need to do that. And I think part of it is because often people would come out of that and they'd make some decisions, really significant decisions about their ministry or about the next step in their vocation or so on, because they just usually were just so busy, you know, going through the motions and doing all the things that needed to be done. And it forces you to go out to talk to other people about it, to pray and so on. And you need to do that. You really do need to take space out. So that was very crucial. So, yeah, sometimes ministers wouldn't want to do it because, you know, you never have time, but you've got to make time.
Yeah. So if someone who's in ministry was listening to our conversation today, what's one thing you would love for them to walk away with, to make a shift or to think about that, you know, you think would be really beneficial for them?
One thing is really hard. Can I say two? Can I say
sure?
Sort of aiming at two different cohorts, I think. So I think I'd say for all women, you know, if you're doing this for God, then trust in God, and don't worry so much about what people are thinking about you. You know, just like, I really saw a change in my ministry after I went through a major time of depression and came out of it. But it just made me kind of go, you know what, I just need to serve God. And sometimes that means saying the difficult things and uncomfortable things. And so I think as a woman, just kind of going, part of my service to God is to bring up things, is to be that voice. Yeah, so that's a challenge, I think, particularly for women who are further on. For women who are just starting out, I would say, you know, and believe people like me need to make this easier for you, but do go out there and try and find training and knock on doors and make them see the gaps that people need to provide training for, and what you need. Don't be afraid to ask for things that you need. I think often as women, we think if I ask for something I need, then I'll seem like a trouble, and, you know. Yes. But yeah, look, we all need it in ministry. So.
Oh, totally agree with that. And if a whole church was listening to this and going, oh, how can we reflect on our own behavior and how we can support our people in ministry? And, you know, happy for you to comment about our women in ministry as well. You know, what would you want to say to them?
Well, I guess firstly, women in ministry, I think we've got to value them. You know, if 60% of the people in our churches are women, then women in ministry are so valuable for the growth and health of our churches. And we need to show them they're valued in all sorts of ways, fair working conditions being one of them. But I think often, you know, if ministry often is unsung, women in ministry is very much underappreciated. So there's that. I think in general, just thinking that, you know, it's actually better for you as a church in the long run if you have ministers who are living well-balanced lives. If you have ministers that have relationships that support them, if you have ministers that are very invested in their families, this is actually good for you. It's not a loss to you. You should do that because it's actually to your benefit and to the whole church's benefit to have healthy people in ministry.
And finally, if we have policymakers, the decision makers, whether at denominational level or at the training level, what's one thing you'd like them to think about?
I actually think they need to have intentional plans. Like they need to sit down with the women in theological education and ministry and all sorts of different sectors of ministry and say, what can we do, and form an intentional plan. Things will not change unless you have that kind of intentionality and put up timeframes and put out actual, written down goals of what you want to do and so on.
Well, Reverend Dr. Megan Powell du Toit, thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a joy. I'm energized for the rest of the day, and I hope all of you who are listening feel energized as well. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for looking into it. That's a real blessing to the church.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you liked what you heard and you think others should hear it too, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Catch you later.